Chapter 4. Raskolnikov went straight to the house on the canal bank, where Sonia lived. It was an old green house 3 floors high. He found the porter, who gave him vague directions as to where to find Kapernaumov, the tailor. Having found the entrance to the dark and narrow staircase in the corner of the courtyard, he went up to the 2nd floor and came out into a gallery that ran round the whole 2nd story over the yard. While he was wandering in the darkness, uncertain where to turn for Kapernaumov's door, a door opened 3 paces from him. He mechanically took hold of it. "Who's there?" a woman's voice asked uneasily. "It's me. Come to see you," answered Raskolnikov, and he walked into the tiny entryway. On a broken chair stood a candle in a battered copper candlestick. "It's you! My goodness!" cried Sonia weakly, and she stood rooted to the spot. "Which is your room? This way?" And Raskolnikov, trying not to look at her, hurried in. A minute later, Sonia too came in with the candle, put down the candlestick, and, completely disconcerted, stood before him inexpressibly agitated and apparently frightened by his unexpected visit. The color rushed suddenly to her pale face, and tears came into her eyes. She felt sick and ashamed, and happy too. Raskolnikov turned away quickly and sat on a chair by the table. He scanned the room in a rapid glance. It was a large but extremely low-ceilinged room, the only one let by the Kapernaumovs, to whose rooms a closed door led in the wall on the left. In the opposite side, on the right-hand wall, was another door, which was always kept locked. That led to the next apartment, which formed a separate lodging. Sonia's room looked like a barn. It was a very irregular quadrangle, giving it a grotesque appearance. A wall with 3 windows looking out onto the canal ran on a slant, so that one corner formed a very acute angle, and it was difficult to see in it without very strong light. The other corner was disproportionately obtuse. There was scarcely any furniture in the big room. In the corner on the right was a bedstead. Beside it, nearest the door, was a chair. A plain deal table, covered by a blue cloth, stood against the same wall, close to the door into the other apartment. 2 rush-seated chairs stood by the table. On the opposite wall, near the acute angle, stood a small, plain wooden chest of drawers, looking, as it were, lost in a desert. That was all there was in the room. The yellow, scratched and shabby wallpaper was black in the corners. It must have been damp and full of fumes in the winter. There was every sign of poverty. Even the bedstead had no curtain. Sonia looked in silence at her visitor, who was so attentively and unceremoniously scrutinizing her room, and at last even began to tremble with terror, as though she were standing before her judge and the arbiter of her destinies. "I am late. 11, isn't it?" he asked, still not lifting his eyes. "Yes," muttered Sonia. "Oh, yes, it is," she added hastily, as though it were her means of escape. "My landlady's clock is just struck. I heard it myself." "I've come to you for the last time," Raskolnikov went on gloomily, although this was the first time. "Perhaps I may not see you again." "Are you going away?" I don't know. Tomorrow. Then you are not coming to Katerina Ivanovna's tomorrow? Sonia's voice shook. I don't know. I shall know tomorrow morning. Never mind that. I've come to say one word. He raised his brooding eyes to her, and suddenly noticed that he was sitting down while she had been standing before him. Why are you standing? Sit down, he said in a changed voice, gentle and friendly. She sat down. He looked kindly and almost compassionately at her. How thin you are! What a hand! Quite transparent, like a dead hand. He took her hand. Sonia smiled faintly. I have always been like that, she said. Even when you lived at home? Yes. Of course you were, he added abruptly, and the expression of his face and the sound of his voice changed again suddenly. He looked round him once more. You rent this room from the Kapernaumos? Yes. They live there, through that door? Yes, they have another room like this. All in one room? Yes. I would be afraid in your room at night, he observed gloomily. They are very good people, very kind, answered Sonia, who still seemed bewildered. And all the furniture, everything is theirs. And they are very kind, and the children, too, often come to see me. They all stammer, don't they? Yes, he stammers and he's lame, and his wife, too. It's not exactly that she stammers, but she can't speak plainly. She is a very kind woman, and he used to be a house serf, and there are 7 children, and it's only the eldest one that stammers, and the others are simply ill. But they don't stammer. But where did you hear about them? She added with some surprise. Your father told me then. He told me all about you, and how you went out at 6 o'clock and came back at 9, and how Katerina Ivanovna knelt down by your bed. Sonia was confused. I thought I saw him today, she whispered hesitatingly. Who? My father. I was walking in the street, out there at the corner, at about 10 o'clock, and he seemed to be walking in front. It looked just like him. I wanted to go to Katerina Ivanovna. You were walking in the streets? Yes, Sonia whispered abruptly, again overcome with confusion and looking down. Katerina Ivanovna used to beat you, I dare say. Oh, no! What are you saying? No! Sonia looked at him almost with dismay. You love her, then? Love her? Of course! Said Sonia with plaintive emphasis, and she clasped her hands in distress. Ah, you don't! If you only knew! You see, she is just like a child. Her mind is entirely unhinged, you see, from sorrow. And how clever she used to be! How generous, how kind! Ah, you don't understand! You don't understand! Sonia said this as though in despair, wringing her hands in excitement and distress. Her pale cheeks flushed. There was a look of anguish in her eyes. It was clear that she was stirred to the depths, that she was longing to speak, to champion, to express something. A sort of insatiable compassion, if you could call it that, was reflected in every feature of her face. Beat me! How can you? Good heavens, beat me! And if she did beat me, what then? What of it? You know nothing about it. She is so unhappy. Ah, how unhappy and ill. She is seeking righteousness. She is pure. She has such faith that there must be righteousness everywhere, and she expects it. And if you were to torture her, she wouldn't do wrong. She doesn't see that it's impossible for people to be righteous, and she is angry at it. Like a child, she is good. And what will happen to you? Sonia looked at him inquiringly. They are left on your hands, you see. They were all on your hands before, though. And your father came to you to beg for drink. Well, how will it be now? I don't know, Sonia articulated mournfully. Will they stay there? I don't know. They are in debt for the lodging, but the landlady, I hear, said today that she wanted to get rid of them, and Katerina Ivanovna says that she won't stay another minute. How has she come to be so bold? She relies on you. Oh, no, don't talk like that. We are one. We live as if we were one. Sonia was agitated again, and even angry, as though a canary or some other little bird were to be angry. And what could she do? What could she do? She persisted, getting hot and excited. And how she cried today! Her mind is unhinged, haven't you noticed it? 1 minute she is worrying like a child that everything will be right tomorrow, the lunch and all that. Then she is wringing her hands, spitting blood, weeping, and all at once she will begin knocking her head against the wall in despair. Then she will be comforted again. She builds all her hopes on you. She says that you will help her now, and that she will borrow a little money somewhere, and go to her native town with me, and set up a boarding school for the daughters of gentlemen, and take me to superintend it, and we will begin a new splendid life. And she kisses and hugs me, comforts me, and you know she has such faith in these dreams of hers. You can't contradict her. And all day long she has been washing, cleaning, mending. She dragged the wash-tub into the room with her feeble hands and sank on the bed, gasping for breath. We went this morning to a store to buy shoes for Polenka and Lida, as theirs are completely worn out. Only the money we brought wasn't enough, not nearly enough. And she picked out such lovely little boots, because she has taste, you don't know. And there in the store she burst out crying in front of the assistants because she hadn't enough. Oh, it was sad to see her. Well, after that I can understand why you live like this, Raskolnikov said with a bitter smile. And aren't you sorry for them? Aren't you sorry? Sonia flew at him again. Why, I know you gave your last penny yourself, though you'd seen nothing of it, and if you'd seen everything, oh dear! And how often I've brought her to tears! Only last week! Yes, only a week before his death! I was cruel, and how often I've done it! I've been wretched at the thought of it all day! Sonia wrung her hands as she spoke at the pain of remembering it. You were cruel? Yes, I went to see them, she went on, weeping. And my father said, "Read me something, Sonia, my head hurts, read to me, here's a book." He had a book he had got from Andrei Semyonovich Lebeziatnikov. He lives there. He always used to get hold of such strange books. And I said, I can't stay, because I didn't want to read, and I'd gone in mainly to show Katerina Ivanovna some collars. Lizaveta, the salesgirl, sold me some collars and cuffs, cheap, pretty, new, embroidered ones. Katerina Ivanovna liked them very much. She put them on and looked at herself in the glass and was delighted with them. "Make me a present out of them, Sonia," she said. "Please do. Please do," she said. She wanted them so much. And when could she wear them? They just reminded her of her old happy days. She looked at herself in the glass, admired herself, and she has no clothes at all, no things of her own, hasn't had all these years. And she never asks anyone for anything. She is proud. She'd sooner give away everything. And these she asked for. She liked them so much. And I was sorry to give them. What use are they to you, Katerina Ivanovna? I said. I spoke like that to her. I shouldn't have said it. She gave me such a look, and she was so upset that I refused her. And it was so sad to see. And she wasn't upset because of the colors, but because I refused. I saw that. Ah, if only I could bring it all back, change it, take back those words. Ah, if I... But it's nothing to you. Did you know Lizaveta, the salesgirl? Yes. Did you know her? Sonia asked with some surprise. Katerina Ivanovna is tubercular, seriously tubercular. Soon she will be dead, said Raskolnikov after a pause, without answering her question. Oh, no, no, no! And Sonia unconsciously clutched both his hands, as though imploring for her not to be. But it will be better if she does die. No, not better at all, Sonia unconsciously repeated in dismay. And the children, what can you do except take them to live with you? Oh, I don't know, cried Sonia, almost in despair, and she put her hands to her head. It was evident that the idea had very often occurred to her before, and he had only raised it again. And what if even now, while Katerina Ivanovna is alive, you get taken ill and are taken to the hospital? What will happen then? He persisted pitilessly. How can you? That can't happen. And Sonia's face was tortured with terror. Can't happen, Raskolnikov went on with a harsh smile. You're not insured against it, are you? What will happen to them then? They'll be in the street, all of them. She'll cough and beg and knock her head against some wall, as she did today, and the children will cry. Then she will fall down, be taken to the police station and to the hospital. She will die, and the children... Oh, no, God will not let it be, broke at last from Sonia's overburdened body. She listened, looking imploringly at him, dumbly clasping her hands as if she were begging him for something, as though it all depended on him. Raskolnikov got up and began to walk around the room. A minute passed. Sonia was standing with her hands in her head hanging in terrible dejection. And can't you save? Put something aside for a rainy day, he asked, stopping suddenly before her. No, whispered Sonia. Of course not. Have you tried? He added, almost ironically. Yes. And it didn't come off? Of course not. No need to ask. And again he paced the room. Another minute passed. You don't get money every day? Sonia was more confused than ever, and color rushed into her face again. No, she whispered with a painful effort. It will be the same with Polenka, no doubt, he said suddenly. No, no, it can't be, no, Sonia cried aloud in desperation, as though she had been stabbed. God would not allow anything so awful. He lets others come to it. No, no, God will protect her! God!" she repeated beside herself. "But perhaps there is no God at all," Raskolnikov answered with a sort of malignance, laughed and looked at her. Sonia's face suddenly changed. A tremor passed over it. She looked at him with unutterable reproach, tried to say something, but could not speak, and broke into bitter, bitter sobs, hiding her face in her hands. "You say Katerina Ivanovna's mind is unhinged. Your own mind is unhinged," he said after a brief silence. 5 minutes passed. He still paced up and down the room in silence, not looking at her. At last he went up to her. His eyes glittered. He put his 2 hands on her shoulders and looked straight into her tearful face. His eyes were hard, feverish, and piercing. His lips were twitching. All at once he bent down quickly, and dropping to the ground, kissed her foot. Sonia drew back from him as from a madman. He certainly looked like a madman. "What are you doing to me?" she muttered, turning pale, and a sudden anguish clutched at her heart. He stood up at once. "I did not bow down to you. I bowed down to all the suffering of humanity," he said wildly, and walked away to the window. "Listen," he added, turning to her a minute later. "I said just now to an insolent man that he was not worth your little finger, and that I did my sister an honor by making her sit with you." "You said that to them, and in her presence?" cried Sonia, frightened. "Sit down with me, an honor? But I'm dishonorable. Why did you say that?" "It was not because of your dishonor and your sin I said that of you, but because of your great suffering. But you are a great sinner, that's true," he added almost solemnly. "And your worst sin is that you have destroyed and betrayed yourself for nothing. Isn't that terrible? Isn't it terrible that you are living in this filth which you loathe so much, and at the same time you know yourself, you've only got to open your eyes, that you are not helping anyone by it, not saving anyone from anything? Tell me," he went on, almost in a frenzy, "how this shame and degradation can exist in you side by side with other opposite holy feelings. It would be better, 1,000 times better and wiser, to leap into the water and end it all." "But what would become of them?" Sonia asked faintly, gazing at him with eyes of anguish, but not seeming surprised at his suggestion. Raskolnikov looked strangely at her. He read it all in her face. So she must have had that thought already, perhaps many times, and earnestly she had thought out in her despair how to end it, and so earnestly that now she scarcely wondered at his suggestion. She had not even noticed the cruelty of his words. The significance of his reproaches and his peculiar attitude to her shame she had, of course, not noticed either, and that, too, was clear to him. But he saw how monstrously the thought of her disgraceful, shameful position was torturing her, and had long tortured her. What, he thought, could have hindered her from putting an end to it? Only then he realized what those poor little orphan children and that pitiful, half-crazy Katerina Ivanovna, tubercular and knocking her head against the wall, meant for Sonia. But nevertheless, it was clear to him again that with her character and the amount of education she had after all received, She could not in any case remain the way she was. He was still confronted by the question of how could she have remained so long in that position without going out of her mind, since she could not bring herself to jump into the water. Of course he knew that Sonia's position was an exceptional case, though unhappily not unique, and not infrequent in fact. But her exceptional nature, her tinge of education, her previous life might, one would have thought, have killed her at the first step on that revolting path. What held her up? Surely not depravity. All that infamy had obviously only touched her mechanically. Not one drop of real depravity had penetrated to her heart. He saw that. He saw through her as she stood before him. There are 3 ways before her, he thought. The canal, the madhouse, or at last to sink into depravity which obscures the mind and turns the heart to stone. The last idea was the most revolting. But he was a skeptic. He was young, abstract, and therefore cruel, and so he could not help believing that the last way was the most likely. But can it be true? He cried to himself. Can that creature, who has still preserved the purity of her spirit, be consciously drawn at last into that sink of filth and iniquity? Can the process already have begun? Can it be that she has only been able to bear it until now, because vice has begun to be less loathsome to her? No, no, that cannot be, he cried, as Sonia had just before. No, what has kept her from the canal until now is the idea of sin, and they the children. And if she has not gone out of her mind... But who says she has not gone out of her mind? Is she in her senses? Can people talk? Can people reason as she does? How can she sit on the edge of the abyss of loathsomeness into which she is slipping, and refuse to listen when she is told about the dangers which face her? Does she expect a miracle? No doubt she does. Doesn't that all mean madness? He stopped obstinately at that thought. In fact, he liked that explanation better than any other. He began looking more intently at her. So you pray to God a great deal, Sonia? He asked her. Sonia did not speak. He stood beside her, waiting for an answer. What would I be without God? She whispered rapidly, forcibly, glancing at him with suddenly flashing eyes and squeezing his hand. Ah, so that is it, he thought. And what does God do for you? He asked, probing her further. Sonia was silent a long while, as though she could not answer. Her weak chest kept heaving with emotion. Be silent! Don't ask! You don't deserve! She cried suddenly, looking sternly and angrily at him. That's it! That's it! He repeated to himself. He does everything, she whispered quickly, looking down again. That's the way out. That's the explanation, he decided, scrutinizing her with eager curiosity, with a new, strange, almost morbid feeling. He gazed at that pale, thin, irregular, angular little face, those soft blue eyes which could flash with such fire, such stern energy, that little body still shaking with indignation and anger. And it all seemed to him more and more strange, almost impossible. She's a religious maniac, he repeated to himself. There was a book lying on the chest of drawers. He had noticed it every time he paced up and down the room. Now he took it up and looked at it. It was the New Testament in the Russian translation. It was bound in leather, old and worn. "Where did you get that?" he called to her across the room. She was still standing in the same place, 3 steps from the table. "It was brought to me," she answered, as if unwillingly, not looking at him. "Who brought it?" "Lizaveta. I asked her for it." Lizaveta. Strange, he thought. Everything about Sonia seemed to him stranger and more wonderful every moment. He carried the book to the candle and began to turn over the pages. "Where is the story of Lazarus?" he asked suddenly. Sonia looked obstinately at the ground and would not answer. She was standing sideways to the table. "Where is the raising of Lazarus? Find it for me, Sonia." She stole a glance at him. "You are not looking in the right place. It's in the 4th Gospel," she whispered sternly, without looking at him. "Find it and read it to me," he said. He sat down with his elbow on the table, leaned his head on his hand, and looked away sullenly, prepared to listen. "In 3 weeks' time they'll welcome me to the madhouse. I shall be there if I'm not in a worse place," he muttered to himself. Sonia heard Raskolnikov's request distrustfully, and moved hesitatingly to the table. She took the book, however. "Haven't you read it?" she asked, looking up at him across the table. Her voice became sterner and sterner. "Long ago, when I was at school. Read it." "And haven't you heard it in church?" "I haven't been. Do you often go?" "No," whispered Sonia. Raskolnikov smiled. "I understand. And you won't go to your father's funeral tomorrow?" "Yes, I shall. I was at church last week, too. I had a requiem service." "For whom?" "For Lizaveta. She was killed with an axe." His nerves were more and more strained. His head began to go round. "You were friends with Lizaveta?" "Yes. She was good. She used to come, not often. She couldn't. We used to read together and talk. She will see God." The last phrase sounded strange in his ears. And here was something new again. The mysterious meetings with Lizaveta, and both of them religious maniacs. "I shall be a religious maniac myself soon. It's infectious." "Read," he cried irritably and insistently. Sonia still hesitated. Her heart was throbbing. She hardly dared to read to him. He looked almost with exasperation at the unhappy lunatic. "What for? You don't believe?" she whispered softly, and as it were breathlessly. "Read, I want you to," he persisted. "You used to read to Lizaveta." Sonia opened the book and found the place. Her hands were shaking, her voice failed her. Twice she tried to begin and could not bring out the first syllable. "Now a certain man was sick, named Lazarus of Bethany," she forced herself at last to read, but at the 3rd word her voice broke like an overstrained string. There was a catch in her breath. Raskolnikov saw in part why Sonia could not bring herself to read to him, and the more he saw this, the more roughly and irritably he insisted on her doing so. He understood only too well how painful it was for her to betray and unveil all that was her own. He understood that these feelings really were her secret treasure, which she had kept perhaps for years, perhaps from childhood, while she lived with an unhappy father and a distracted stepmother crazed by grief, in the midst of starving children and unseemly abuse and reproaches. But at the same time he knew now, and knew for certain, that, although it filled her with dread and suffering, yet she had a tormenting desire to read, and to read to him that he might hear it, and to read now whatever might come of it. He read this in her eyes. He could see it in her intense emotion. She mastered herself, controlled the spasm in her throat, and went on reading the 11th chapter of St. John. She went on to the 19th verse. "And many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him, but Mary sat still in the house. Then said Martha unto Jesus, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. But I know that even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee." Then she stopped again with the shamefaced feeling that her voice would quiver and break again. Jesus said unto her, Thy brother shall rise again. Martha saith unto him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? She saith unto him, and drawing a painful breath, Sonia read distinctly and forcibly, as though she were making a public confession of faith. Yea, Lord, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world. She stopped and looked up quickly at him, but controlling herself went on reading. Raskolnikov sat without moving, his elbows on the table and his eyes turned away. She read to the 32nd verse. Then when Mary was come where Jesus was, and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying unto him, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping which came with her, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled, and said, Where have ye laid him? They said unto him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. Then said the Jews, Behold how he loved him. And some of them said, Could not this man which opened the eyes of the blind have caused that even this man should not have died? Raskolnikov turned and looked at her with emotion. Yes, he had known it. She was trembling in a real physical fever. He had expected it. She was getting near the story of the greatest miracle, and a feeling of immense triumph came over her. Her voice rang out like a bell. Triumph and joy gave it power. The lines danced before her eyes, but she knew what she was reading by heart. At the last verse, Could not this man which opened the eyes of the blind? Dropping her voice, she passionately reproduced the doubt, the reproach and censure of the blind, disbelieving Jews, who in another moment would fall at his feet as though struck by thunder, sobbing and believing. And he too is blinded and unbelieving. He too will hear. He too will believe. Yes, at once now," was what she was dreaming, and she was quivering with happy anticipation. "Jesus, therefore, again groaning in himself, cometh to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. Jesus said, Take ye away the stone. Martha, the sister of him that was dead, saith unto him, Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead 4 days. She laid emphasis on the word 4. Jesus saith unto her, Said I not unto thee that if thou wouldest believe, thou shouldest see the glory of God? Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me. And I know that thou hearest me always. But because of the people which stand by I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. And when he thus had spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth. She read loudly, cold and trembling with ecstasy, as though she were seeing it before her eyes. Bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin. Jesus saith unto them, Loose him, and let him go. Then many of the Jews which came to Mary, and had seen the things which Jesus did, believed in him. She could read no more, closed the book, and got up from her chair quickly. That is all about the raising of Lazarus, she whispered severely and abruptly. And turning away she stood motionless, not daring to raise her eyes to him. She still trembled feverishly. The candle end was flickering out in the battered candlestick, dimly lighting up in the poverty-stricken room the murderer and the harlot who had so strangely been reading together the eternal book. 5 minutes or more passed. I came to speak of something, Raskolnikov said aloud, frowning. He got up and went to Sonia. She lifted her eyes to him in silence. His face was particularly stern, and there was a sort of savage determination in it. I have abandoned my family today, he said. My mother and sister. I am not going to see them. I've broken with them completely. What for? Asked Sonia, amazed. Her recent meeting with his mother and sister had left a great impression which she could not analyze. She heard his news almost with horror. I have only you now, he added. Let us go together. I've come to you. We are both accursed. Let us go our way together. His eyes glittered, as though he were mad, Sonia thought, in her turn. Go where? She asked in alarm, and she involuntarily stepped back. How do I know? I only know it's the same road. I know that and nothing more. It's the same goal. She looked at him and understood nothing. She knew only that he was terribly, infinitely unhappy. No one of them will understand if you tell them, but I have understood. I need you. That is why I have come to you. I don't understand, whispered Sonia. You'll understand later. Haven't you done the same? You, too, have overstepped your boundaries, have had the strength to overstep them. You have laid hands on yourself. You have destroyed a life. Your own. It's all the same. You might have lived in spirit and understanding, but you'll end in the Haymarket. But you won't be able to stand it, and if you remain alone, you'll go out of your mind like me. You are like a mad creature already. So we must go together on the same road. Let us go." "What for? What's all this for?" said Sonia, strangely and violently agitated by his words. "What for? Because you can't remain like this, that's why. You must look things straight in the face at last, and not weep like a child and cry that God won't allow it. What will happen if you really are taken to the hospital tomorrow? She is mad and tubercular. She'll die soon, and the children. Do you mean to tell me Polenka won't come to grief? Haven't you seen children here at the street corners sent out by their mothers to beg? I've found out where those mothers live and what surroundings they live in. Children can't remain children there. At 7, the child is vicious and a thief. Yet children, you know, are the image of Christ. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He bade us honor and love them. They are the humanity of the future." "What's to be done? What's to be done?" repeated Sonia, weeping hysterically and wringing her hands. "What's to be done? Break what must be broken once and for all, that's all, and take the suffering on yourself. What, you don't understand? You'll understand later. Freedom and power, and above all power. Above all trembling creation, the whole ant heap. That's the goal, remember that. That's my farewell message. Perhaps it's the last time I shall speak to you. If I don't come tomorrow, you'll hear of it all, and then remember these words. And some day later on, in years to come, you'll understand perhaps what they meant. If I come tomorrow, I'll tell you who killed Lizaveta. Goodbye." Sonia started with terror. "Why, do you know who killed her?" she asked, chilled with horror, looking wildly at him. "I know and will tell. You, only you. I have chosen you. I'm not coming to you to ask forgiveness, but simply to tell you. I chose you long ago to hear this. When your father talked about you, and when Lizaveta was alive, I thought of it. Goodbye. Don't shake hands. Until tomorrow." He went out. Sonia gazed at him as she would at a madman. But she herself felt as if she were insane and knew it. Her head was whirling. "My goodness, how does he know who killed Lizaveta? What did those words mean? It's awful." But at the same time, the idea did not enter her head, not for a moment. "Oh, he must be terribly unhappy. He has abandoned his mother and sister. What for? What has happened? And what did he have in mind? What did he say to her? He had kissed her foot and said... Yes, he had said it clearly, that he could not live without her. Oh, merciful heavens!" Sonia spent the whole night feverish and delirious. She jumped up from time to time, wept and wrung her hands, then sank again into feverish sleep, and dreamt of Polenka, Katerina Ivanovna, and Lizaveta, of reading the Gospel, and him with pale face, with burning eyes, kissing her feet, weeping. On the other side of the door on the right, which divided Sonia's room from Madame Reslick's apartment, was a room which long stood empty. A card was fixed on the gate, and a notice stuck in the windows over the canal advertising it to let. Sonia had long been accustomed to the room being uninhabited. But all that time Mr. Svidrigailov had been standing, listening at the door of the empty room. When Raskolnikov went out, he stood still, thought a moment, went on tiptoe to his own room which adjoined the empty one, brought a chair and noiselessly carried it to the door that led to Sonia's room. The conversation had struck him as interesting and remarkable, and he had greatly enjoyed it. So much so that he brought a chair that he might not in the future, tomorrow for instance, have to endure the inconvenience of standing a whole hour, but would be able to listen in comfort. Breaking in. This chapter is loaded with thematic significance, on most of which I'll postpone comment until later. For now, there are just a few observations to make about the details. The extended reference to John 11 is, of course, entirely overt, and the idea of that particular biblical story was surely put into Raskolnikov's mind by Porfiry Petrovich in Part 3, Chapter 5. Perhaps Raskolnikov identifies himself with the man in the tomb in need of resurrection, even as Sonia identifies him with the incredulous Jews witnessing the wondrous event. Other references to the Gospel are a bit more subtle. The light from the candle illuminates, in Garnett's translation, the murderer and the harlot. The antiquated term is deliberate. As Joseph Frank points out, in the original Russian, Dostoevsky uses a term from an older dialect of the Orthodox Church to refer to Mary Magdalene. Also, some commentators, such as Priscilla Meyer, find significance in the name of Sonia's landlord. Kapernaumov resembles Capernaum, which was the base of operations for Christ's Galilean ministry. Sonia, like Jesus, seems to be embarking on redemptive work, and perhaps her home is headquarters for this ministry. Much is made of Sonia's dire situation in this chapter. When Raskolnikov says that she will wind up in the Haymarket, he is referring to the natural career arc of the prostitute, which starts off much better than it ends. The notorious Haymarket with which he is so intimately familiar is where the cheapest used-up prostitutes go to meet a squalid demise. This chapter contains yet another ghost sighting, which happens so quickly one can easily miss it. Sonia believes she saw her deceased father on the street while she was attempting to attract customers. We can add this to the dream of Pulcheria Alexandrovna, the multiple encounters Svidrigailov has had during his waking hours, and the ghost-like encounters that Raskolnikov has had, both dreaming and waking, 3 of which occurred in Part 3, Chapter 6. This chapter marks the end of a very long day, which began 115 pages ago, back in Part 3, Chapter 2. By my count, this puts him a week out from the murders, although for 4 of those days he was unconscious. Lazarus was similarly unconscious for 4 days. Raskolnikov has 2 appointments tomorrow, the 11 o'clock meeting with Porfiry Petrovich, and then the afternoon funeral lunch with the Marmeladovs. He recognizes that he will need some good fortune to make the second one. End of comments.